Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Uh, I, it is so true that Americans right now are living paycheck to paycheck, working to make things, make ends meet, and so much of that is due to the inflation that Americans have seen, in large part due to our massive spending. I hope Americans are listening to this hearing, because when we hear from our friends across the side of the aisle that we don't have a spending problem, that is just a notion that's beyond any sort of reality. Because the fact is that we've had record revenues over the last several years, up till very recently, and spending, no matter how much we're bringing in, continues to be a problem. And so we've got to address our spending issues and get things under control. One of the things that I was concerned about is there's a request for continued funding and expansion of the IRS to go after American taxpayers. Meanwhile, the IRS at the same time announced earlier this year that it's setting a goal for employees to be in the office just 50% of the time in May. So we're being asked to employ more federal workforce, and this is true across all the agencies. Anyone who does caseworks knows that anything from passports to VA benefits to farm help to helping people with Social Security benefits, that the timeline to get cases solved has massively expanded while the federal workforce continues to go, quote, to teleworking. And so the productivity is going down, but we're being asked to solve that by adding more people instead of finding ways to bring higher productivity. So I would encourage us to find ways to get people back to work. We're expecting the people who are funding the salaries of the IRS taxpayers to get people to work. And so I would recommend that we do that. You had a thought?
Well, we're making sure that IRS, as well as all bureaus and Treasury departmental offices, meet the standards that have been set for the federal government, which is at least 50% time for everyone in the office. And many employees have to be there absolutely every day. And this applies absolutely to IRS employees in many parts of the IRS.
To the veterans that I'm working to try to get cases solved for them, 50% isn't enough to show up at work.
Well,
and literally speaking, one of the facilities was a literal work warehouse where the VA records are stored and have not been digitized. We funded them, I think it was to the tune of $60 million to digitize those records. They didn't do it because of COVID protocols. We tried to put in non-teleworking. You cannot telework when you have to literally walk through the aisles and look through file cabinets. And we couldn't even get teleprovisions passed by our friends on the left who opposed that provision. We've got to get people back to work so that we can solve these problems for the American people. I wanted to talk to you about a little bigger of an issue, and that is the strength of the U.S. dollar. It's essentially important to the safety and security, freedom of the world, to have America have a strong influence. We've seen challenges against the U.S. dollar, a lot of it connected to our spending. I mean, as you know, we used to have a gold dollar, now we have a petrodollar that was based on, an agreement really with Saudi Arabia to trade oil and gas using the American dollar. Very recently, we've seen, and there's conflicting reports, but at a minimum, Saudi Arabia is considering joining BRICS, which has been built for the fundamental purpose of challenging the U.S. dollar. And I'm curious about your take on that. This administration has an attack on the oil and gas industry in spite of that, and how that plays into monetary policy I'm very concerned about. But then also this administration and President Biden, when he was vice president, said, and this is a quote, "We are trying to create a multipolar world." In other words, we're trying to create a world where the United States is not the preeminent force. Now, most taxpayers would say that we should share the goal, regardless of where we are on the aisle, of United States remaining a premier influence in the world. So I would ask you, as you're addressing spending policy and these kind of things, do you share that goal of bringing the United States down a notch and us not being the premier influence in the world?
I do not share the goal of bringing the U.S. down a notch. I think it's essential that the U.S. Shows strong leadership throughout the global economy and leadership on the full range of challenges the world faces. I strongly believe the U.S. dollar needs to remain the world's primary reserve currency. And I see few challenges, real challenges to the U.S. dollar. It may be that there are BRICS countries that would love not to be dependent on the dollar, but none of those countries seem willing to accept any of those currencies as an alternative for doing business. And there's a very good reason for that. The U.S. is a well-managed country from a macro perspective. Inflation has for decades been low and stable. We have the deepest and most liquid capital markets in the world, and a rule of law and institutions that support the dollar's use as a reserve currency. Now, it is helpful when we want to impose sanctions on other countries. The dollar's role enables us to do that because by using our sanctions tools to prevent malign actors from running transactions through the financial system.
I understand that, but I think
there's a
we would
desire.
be, if we have a lot of strengths, but if we're not wary of the fact that historically speaking, when a currency collapses, it happens overnight. We've got to shore up our fiscal.
Need to move on. Mr. Pocan.